So recently I got my hands on an indie game called Peripeteia. To give a little bit of background, it's a game that I've had on my Steam wishlist since 2020, and it has soaked up pretty much all of my attention since its release. It's an immersive sim made by a small indie team called Ninth Exodus, and it just recently entered early access. The teaser that initially sold me on this game back during COVID was made for a game reveal presentation known as V3, and from what I can tell, all footage of that event seems to be either lost or buried under a mountain of unrelated search results. God, you remember when YouTube's search bar used to actually work? I fucking hate this. Look, the point I'm trying to reach is that this game has been sitting in the back of my head for about half a decade now, and playing this has been fucking surreal. I genuinely thought this game was just going to end up as vaporware, but they somehow managed to publish an actual game. So I kinda have to say something about it. So in this video, I want to talk about that. I'll gush over the stuff I like, levy out some criticism where I believe it's necessary, point out some issues that need to be corrected, and provide some ideas since this game's still in development. For the regulars on my channel, you can consider this video as a prelude to my 2 upcoming projects. And if you're listening, YouTube, why the hell are you not pushing my videos? I get this site is a business, but what happened to broadcast yourself? All I did was read a few scary stories for Halloween. It's a tradition on my channel, and now all of a sudden this site just won't recommend my shit anymore, even though I have moved back to my normal content. Do you think you can just stuff me into a categorical box and then throw me under the bus once I decide to deviate from that label? I ought to drag you quitters by your socks to a rapid wood chipper dumped in xenomorphic acid and snip your flaccid dicks off, you super pricks! As for everyone else, sit back and strap in, because I've got a lot to say. In Peripeteia, you play as Marie, an android with amnesia who's caught in the middle of a conflict between communist and fascist forces in an alternate history Poland. You go from level to level through the use of a mission select screen in your apartment, gathering clues regarding the whereabouts of a certain bunker while causing a lot of chaos in the process. The setting pulls heavily from cyberpunk literature, with Blame in particular being a major point of inspiration. Peripeteia isn't afraid to get rather political as well, which I find highly commendable since it helps to sell the world and its story. Without spoiling too much, the country of Poland is basically in a state of civil war throughout the game. A lot of the nation has been left in ruins, and nobody's really doing anything to pick up the pieces. Those who aren't involved in either side are keeping their heads down, trying to survive while tanks roll through the streets and helicopters blast through windows. It's overall a very bleak depiction of a war-torn nation, and it helps to separate the game from other immersive sims like Deus Ex or Cruelty Squad. I won't be talking much about Marie's backstory in this video. My reason for this is because the game is still in early access. There's elements about the level order which don't make a whole lot of sense narratively, so I'm giving the developers this opportunity to revise their story. Like, I don't understand why Mission 4 isn't the final level of this game, for example. The contents of the level are great, and I don't think you need to really change anything that's there, but this feels like the climax of the story. I don't understand how the stakes could possibly get any bigger than this. I think there also needs to be a better explanation in the game's story as to why you can only quick save in Mission 4. It's just a little weird that Mission 4 suddenly makes saving your file a diegetic part of the story. I get that the reason she can't save is because she sustained damage from a crash, but it means that actions such as save scumming are now suddenly a part of the game and its lore diegetically. I would actually suggest adding manual save points in the world so that it feels less out of place in Mission 4. It would also help reduce save scumming throughout the entire game. That way, you could just disable quick saves entirely on this level and have the player rely entirely on the save points. But yeah, that's the only real gripe I have with this level. Otherwise, it's pretty fun once you know what you're doing. Outside of the missions, there's also a small apartment setting that serves as a sort of hub area. It's essentially Marie's home base, and it's where the player is able to select their next mission. You can also make small talk with your neighbor next door and your pet cactus, and there's a convenience store that you can break into using the guns in the apartment's basement. As for where the apartment sections take place in the story, well, it's a little confusing. The game acts as though the events in the apartment take place after every level, but it doesn't make sense why Marie would go back to her apartment between each mission. And this isn't me being a dumbass American. I know that European nations are relatively small compared to my country. It doesn't take very long to get around in a country like Poland. Hell, a drive from France to Poland would take only 17 hours. The point I'm trying to make here is that it doesn't make sense why Marie would remember where her apartment is. The whole story is about her having amnesia and following leads to discover her past. Finally, the character writing in this game is, well, I personally describe it as Gopnik. Your character can be a prick sometimes, which I like by the way, please don't change that, and the game itself is often quite edgy. It's clearly done in order to give this game its punk attitude, and I don't think it comes from a place of malice. If anything, it helps to make the world feel more genuine, similar to games like Morrowind. I also really like a lot of the interactions with the soldiers. It's easily the most charming part about this game, and I wish there were more characters to interact with and do jobs for in each level. As mentioned previously, Peripeteia has an episodic structure. Each episode consists of a sandbox level, and you're expected to procure weapons and gear on site as you go about completing your mission. It reminds me almost of Metal Gear Solid in that regard, and my only gripe is that this design choice is never explained by the story. But despite that, I do like this because it keeps the player from getting complacent. On top of this, the game has an insane parkour system that puts even Mirror's Edge to shame. It's clear that Peripeteia takes direct inspiration from the original Thief, but in practice, it's more like playing a first-person Assassin's Creed game. It's genuinely impressive just how liberating this system can be, and I can only imagine what speedruns of this game will look like in a year from now. During each level, you're basically just thrown into the world and are expected to figure shit out on your own. Generally, there's a guy near the spawn point you can speak to who will point you in some sort of direction. But in general, the game rewards players that explore the maps in their entirety. The game doesn't really hold your hand whatsoever. NPCs will just give you vague directions, and if you're lucky, you'll also receive a picture of your destination. Much like any good immersive sim, you're basically left to complete these levels however you want, and there's multiple different routes you can take to complete a level. The highlight of this game so far is without a doubt missions 3, 4, and 5. Each of these levels offer a very unique map layout, and they're all incredibly huge. The only real outlier in this regard is Mission 2. It's a much smaller map by comparison, and its objective is rather straightforward. Like, I don't hate this level, and it would probably be less distracting if there were a few more like it. But for the most part, you're dealing with gigantic maps that put even Halo to shame. It's insane how interconnected the levels are in each mission, and not only do they contain alternate routes for completion, but they each provide different outcomes as well. Mission 3 is probably the high point of this game as far as player choice goes. You're basically given the option to either take out the communist leader or side with the rebels and blow up a power plant. It's such an incredible set piece, and the mission structure itself provides a lot of opportunities for emergent gameplay. It's without a doubt my favorite mission in the game, with Mission 4 being a very close second. Belgrade is basically the final exam of Peripeteia, especially if you're going for the alternate ending. Mission 4 starves you of ammo throughout its entire runtime, and the map itself is basically a series of interconnected corridors that contain a bunch of enemies and shortcuts. My advice is to make sure you find all the weapons in this level and avoid killing needlessly, and for the love of God, do not use the Yugoslav M53 until you get to the very end. You'll thank me later. And while we're on the topic of weapons, Peripeteia has a huge inventory system, and the items you can carry are incredibly modular. Aside from stuff like suppressors and bayonets, you can also take the magazines out of guns and either add or remove ammunition from them. So in practice, you'll often spend quite a bit organizing your inventory between battles. On top of this, it means that if you don't have any spare magazines set aside, you may need to manually refill the mag you're currently using if you need to reload, which will require taking cover. The menu system generally takes a few minutes to manage at first, but with time, you'll be speeding through the inventory menu like a monkey on crack. Now, let's talk about guns for a minute. If you're someone who enjoys games that have an assload of weapons, then oh boy does this game have you covered. Not only are there dozens of real-world weapons to choose from, but there's also a few joke weapons that you can use if you're interested in doing funny challenge runs. This piece of shit is probably my favorite gun in the whole game, simply because it's so fucking awful. It's really fun to mess with, and I'd love to see someone try and complete Mission 3 using only the shitty AK. Aside from the weapons, there's also a lot of consumables that you can use. This game takes a lot of pages from the original Deus Ex, and one of those happens to be the locational damage system. You can break your legs, break your arms, and even give yourself a concussion. Basically, it's like if Fallout 3 was actually well designed. Now, there's a few ways you can go about healing yourself, but trust me when I say you want to chug vodka. It's the best healing item in the game, and you can get about 5 swigs from it before you have to toss it. Finally, there's the augmentation system. For starters, I'm a little on the fence about augmentations taking up inventory space. I think it's healthy in terms of game balancing, but from a world building perspective, it's a little odd to me that Marie can just hot swap augmentations from herself on the fly. World building issues aside though, the augmentation system is incredibly fun to mess with. You've got augs that can slow down time, hijack the bodies of NPCs, turn the game into Splinter Cell, you name it. It's about as intuitive as the augs in Deus Ex, and because of the limited inventory space, you can't reliably use all of them at once, which only helps to give the game even more replay value. Overall, the inventory system and the different mechanics tied to it are all fantastic. It's easily my favorite part about this game now that I've gotten to grips with it, and it adds a whole other layer of planning and tension during missions. Non-player character interactions in Peripeteia can be split up into two categories: allies and enemies. Whether a character is considered an ally or enemy usually depends on two factors. First, are you trespassing into their territory? If the answer is yes, then the entire faction will turn on you completely. And second, are they a scripted enemy? An example of this would be like the guys in Belgrade, since there's basically no other faction in that level aside from a few stray prisoners. If you answered no to both of these questions, then the character in question probably won't be immediately hostile towards you. The only reason they'll turn hostile is if you start unloading rounds into them or their buddies. But for the most part, they have no reason to attack you. You're basically just a passerby in the context of the story. I will say though that I wish there were more friendly NPC encounters in this game. The hallway weirdo from the apartment and the thing in the sewers are both memorable examples of friendly NPCs, but it would be nice if there were more characters to find and talk to. Furthermore, I wish more of these characters had quests you could do for them. As for the enemy behavior, I don't know if they're like the most organized thing. I really do like how these guys push during firefights, and they're overall pretty entertaining to mow down. The speedy guys are also pretty fucking terrifying, especially in Belgrade. I kinda wish the bosses weren't so spongy, but the normal enemies here are really fun. I also like how ammo drops work on these guys. Basically, if you want to procure ammo from the enemies, you need to kill them before they unload a bunch of rounds. Otherwise, their guns will basically be empty by the time you drop them. It's a system that pushes the player to get better at the game, and it makes firefights a lot more interesting since it means there's an actual cost to playing conservatively. Before I wrap things up, I do want to give some additional thoughts on what else could be improved. These aren't exactly deal breakers, but I think it would make the game a lot more fun and increase the game's replay value. First off, you might want to consider expanding the scope of the apartment level. The hallway weirdo is a lot of fun to talk to, but there's still a lot of room to flesh out the building and the outside street area. A good hub world generally has a lot of stuff to interact with. It doesn't need to be mandatory content, nor does it need to be vital to the overarching story. I'm just saying that having more stuff to do or interact with would go a long way. Secondly, I wish Peripeteia had a deathmatch mode or something. It would be like Halo 2 on crack. You could have maps with weapon spawn points that play to the strengths of the game's parkour system, and you could have players loot weapons and ammo off of the bodies of other players. But on top of this, there would also be the additional layer of complexity through the use of the game's inventory system. It would create a whole other level of tension during combat, and I think it would make for a really fun gameplay loop that's fun to learn and master. Finally, I think it'd be cool if this game had side-op levels akin to something like Metal Gear Solid 5. It would help to squeeze out a lot more replay value out of the maps in this game, and you could also use those side missions as a vehicle to expand the game's world building. A lot of these areas consist of pretty big sandboxes, and they all have a lot of empty space. You could totally repurpose these maps and make entirely new missions out of them. Anyways, that's about all I've got to say in this video. Again, I'm really excited to see how this game turns out in a year from now, and I hope I at least convinced some of you to give it a shot. Thank you for watching, check out my other shit, and I'll see you all in the next one. Oh, and for those of you who are here because of my Yu-Gi-Oh content, I'll be publishing the rulebook for my alternative format immediately when it's done. Okay, the video's over for real this time. See ya.